Trump just went off furious after the latest move by the judge overseeing James Comey's case. He says the whole thing reeks of favoritism, that the same people who chased him for years are now being quietly protected. And while that's unfolding in Washington, a bombshell just dropped in California. 5 top officials tied to Governor Gavin Newsom, including his former chief of staff, have been arrested in a massive corruption scandal involving luxury trips, backdated contracts, and laundered political funds. 2 scandals, one about justice being bent, the other about power being abused. Let's unpack what's really going on, because these stories might be more connected than they look. Think about what we're witnessing right now. On one coast, you have a judge handling the prosecution of James Comey, a man who was at the center of investigations into Trump for years, and that judge is facing questions about whether the process itself was corrupted. On the other coast, you have California's most powerful governor watching his inner circle get arrested for the kind of old-fashioned corruption we thought went out of style decades ago: wire fraud, money laundering, backdated contracts, luxury spending disguised as business expenses. What connects these 2 stories? It's not geography, it's not even party politics, really. It's something deeper. It's about who gets accountability and who gets protection. It's about whether the rules apply equally or whether they bend depending on your connections, your status, your usefulness to the people in charge. Let's start with Trump's fury, because understanding his reaction helps us see why millions of Americans feel the same way. When reports started circulating about irregularities in how the Comey case was being handled, questions about evidence, concerns about whether proper procedures were followed, whispers about FBI agents accessing privileged attorney-client communications, Trump didn't hold back. He called it exactly what it looked like to him: corruption protecting its own. And you know what? Whether you love Trump or can't stand him, his point hits home for a lot of people. Because here's what happened. Comey, the former FBI director who opened investigations into Trump, who wrote memos about their conversations, who became a central figure in years of political warfare, he's now facing charges himself. But instead of a straightforward prosecution, the case has become mired in controversy. Defense lawyers argue that government evidence might be tainted. There are allegations that an FBI agent may have improperly obtained access to communications between Comey and his legal team. And then there's the matter of the grand jury itself. This is where it gets particularly troubling. According to reports that emerged from court filings, when prosecutors first presented their case to a grand jury, the jurors declined to indict. They returned what's called a no bill, essentially saying they didn't see enough evidence to charge Comey. But the prosecutor didn't accept that answer. Instead, she kept the grand jurors there for hours, representing evidence, reframing arguments, until finally, by just 2 votes, an indictment was secured. Now, is that illegal? Not necessarily. Prosecutors have some latitude in how they present cases. But is it ethical? Does it look like justice? Or does it look like someone determined to get a specific outcome, no matter what? And more importantly, do you think Trump would have gotten that kind of persistence if the roles were reversed? Or would the no bill have been the end of it? For Trump and his supporters, this feels like déjà vu. It's the same pattern they've seen over and over. When investigations target Trump or his associates, every aggressive tactic is justified. Pre-dawn raids, leaked grand jury information, charges piled on top of charges. But when someone from the other side faces scrutiny, suddenly there are concerns about fairness, about process, about whether we're being too harsh. The emotional weight of this cannot be overstated. Imagine spending years under investigation, watching your associates prosecuted, your reputation dragged through every news cycle, your family subjected to endless scrutiny. Then imagine watching the very people who led those investigations face gentle treatment when their turn comes. That's what Trump sees. That's what millions of Americans see. And whether they're right or wrong, that perception is powerful. It shapes how people view not just individual cases, but the entire justice system. And here's the thing, Trump's anger isn't just about one man. It's not even primarily about Comey himself. It's about what the case represents. The idea that there's a protected class in Washington, people who can bend rules, leak information, weaponize their positions, and never truly face consequences. Because even when charges are filed, even when the process moves forward, There's always some procedural question, some technicality, some sympathetic judge willing to slow things down or throw doubt on the evidence. That's the frustration you hear in Trump's voice. And honestly, can you blame him? Think about your own life. Think about times when you saw someone get away with something you know you'd be punished for. How did that feel? Did it make you trust the system more or less? Did it make you feel like the rules were fair, or like they were just tools for whoever had enough power to manipulate them? But Trump's anger, as vivid and understandable as it is, might actually be pointing us towards something even bigger. Because while Washington argues over fairness in the Comey prosecution, California just delivered a stark reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and corruption becomes routine. Governor Gavin Newsom was recently abroad, enjoying diplomatic appearances in Brazil, taking the opportunity to criticize the Trump administration as the most corrupt in American history. Bold words. Strong words. The kind of words that make headlines and rally your base. Except there was one small problem. While Newsom was making those accusations from a beach in South America, back home in California, federal agents were arresting 5 people closely tied to his administration, including his longtime former chief of staff, Dana Williamson. 23 criminal charges: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, obstruction of justice, filing false tax returns, lying to federal investigators. This wasn't some minor ethics violation or questionable donation. This was old-school, brass-knuckle corruption, the kind where you allegedly take money from dormant political campaign accounts and funnel it into personal luxuries while creating fake contracts and backdated paperwork to cover your tracks. The irony is almost too perfect, isn't it? The governor calls someone else corrupt while his own house is collapsing. Now, to be fair, Newsom himself hasn't been charged with anything. His office quickly issued a statement saying Williamson no longer works for the administration and that the governor expects all public servants to uphold the highest standards of integrity. Standard political damage control. But the optics? Devastating. Let's talk about what allegedly happened here, because the details matter. According to federal prosecutors, Dana Williamson, who ran Newsom's administration as chief of staff, the second most powerful position in California state government, helped orchestrate a scheme to divert around $200,000 from an inactive political campaign fund. This wasn't some abandoned account from decades ago. This was active during the period from early 2022 through late 2024, which means it was happening while Williamson was still serving in Newsom's administration. The money went toward what prosecutors describe as a lavish lifestyle: private jet flights, luxury hotel stays, high-end home furnishings, designer handbags. All of this was allegedly disguised as legitimate business expenses through carefully constructed and in some cases backdated contracts designed to make it look legal if anyone ever came asking questions. They set up what's known as a money laundering scheme, where funds move through multiple accounts and entities to obscure their real destination. And there's more. Prosecutors say that when federal investigators started looking into Paycheck Protection Program loans made to a business Williamson owned, she allegedly backdated contracts to thwart the FBI's investigation. Then, when it came time to file tax returns, she deducted these luxury purchases, things like designer bags and private flights, as if they were ordinary business expenses. False tax returns. That's not a gray area. That's not an interpretation issue. That's fraud. But perhaps the most troubling detail is this. Williamson also allegedly created no-show jobs, where associates were put on payroll, but did no actual work. One person's spouse was paid a salary despite providing no services. This is the kind of corruption you read about in history books, the kind that used to bring down political machines in Chicago or New York a century ago. Except this was happening in 2023 and 2024 in the nation's most populous state. Now, here's where these two stories, the Comey case and the Newsom arrests, start to reveal a common thread. In both situations, you have people who presented themselves as guardians of integrity, as figures standing up for justice and proper conduct, who then become entangled in serious allegations of wrongdoing. And in both situations, you see a system that seems to apply different standards depending on who you are and what side you're on. Comey positioned himself as the Boy Scout of Washington, the straight arrow who wouldn't be influenced by politics. Yet his handling of investigations during the Trump era raised serious questions about bias and procedural fairness. Now, as he faces charges himself, those questions are compounded by concerns about whether he's receiving preferential treatment, a sympathetic judge, procedural delays, technical challenges to evidence that might not be available to an ordinary defendant. Williamson worked for a governor who constantly lectures about ethics, about holding people accountable, about the moral failings of his political opponents. Yet prosecutors allege she was running a corruption operation right under his nose, or perhaps with his knowledge, we don't know yet for years. And the response from Newsom's office? Carefully worded statements about integrity and letting the legal process play out. No outrage, no accountability, just political survival mode. This is what drives people crazy. This is what Trump taps into when he talks about a rigged system. It's not that corruption doesn't get prosecuted, sometimes clearly it does, as the California arrests show. It's that the process feels selective, inconsistent, shaped more by political considerations than by blind justice. When someone useful to the establishment faces trouble, the system finds ways to slow-walk consequences. When someone threatening to the establishment faces trouble, the system moves with startling speed and severity. Think about how this looks to an average American, especially those of you who've been around long enough to remember when scandals actually ended careers. You remember Watergate, when a president resigned because he lost the confidence of his own party. You remember Iran-Contra, when accountability, however imperfect, was at least part of the conversation. You remember when elected officials caught in corruption schemes would step down in disgrace rather than lawyer up and fight for years. What happened to that? When did we move from a culture where shame still mattered to one where survival is the only goal, where admitting fault is seen as weakness, where every scandal becomes just another political battle to be won or lost? The answer, I think, is that we've been sliding in this direction for a long time, but it's accelerated dramatically in recent years. And Trump, for all his flaws, has become a symbol of that fight, not because he's perfect, but because he refuses to accept the double standard quietly. When Trump sees prosecutors resigned rather than participate in investigations they consider unethical, when he sees his former chief of staff or longtime associates facing the full weight of government power while figures like Comey get procedural protection, he's not imagining the disparity. It's real, and it's visible to anyone willing to look honestly at the pattern. So let's look at that pattern more closely, because understanding it helps explain why trust in institutions has collapsed so dramatically. You have elites, people in positions of power and influence, who spend enormous energy lecturing everyone else about integrity, accountability, and following the rules. They write op-eds, they give interviews, they position themselves as the moral center of our political life. But then, when their own conduct comes under scrutiny, suddenly all that certainty disappears. Suddenly everything is complicated. Suddenly we need to be careful about rushing to judgment. This isn't a left versus right issue, though it often gets framed that way. It's an elite versus everyone else issue. It's about whether the people who make and enforce the rules consider themselves bound by those same rules, or whether they see them as tools to be used against opponents and obstacles to be navigated when they become inconvenient. Think about the California scandal. Prosecutors allege that Dana Williamson and her associates were living high on political funds that were supposed to be used for campaigning or held in trust. Private jets, designer handbags, five-star hotels, all while regular Californians struggled with the highest taxes in the nation, with homelessness exploding in every major city, with small businesses crushed under regulatory burdens and pandemic restrictions that somehow never seemed to apply equally to the well-connected. Do you remember when California officials were caught at fancy restaurants during lockdowns they'd imposed on everyone else? When they attended parties and gatherings while telling ordinary citizens they couldn't see their own families? That same mentality, rules for thee but not for me, seems to run through this corruption scandal like a thread through fabric. And people are tired of it. They're exhausted by the hypocrisy. But here's what makes it even more frustrating. When you dig into how these systems actually work, you find that the double standard isn't accidental, it's built in. It's structural. The people running these investigations, the prosecutors making charging decisions, the judges overseeing cases, they're all part of the same professional and social networks as the people they're supposed to hold accountable. They went to the same schools. They attend the same conferences. They share the same assumptions about who deserves the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. This is why Trump's anger resonates so widely. He's an outsider, say what you will about his wealth and background. He was never part of the club. And because he wasn't part of the club, he got treated differently. The intensity of scrutiny he faced, the willingness of institutions to pursue every possible angle of investigation, the leaks to media, the anonymous sources, the breathless coverage of every allegation, none of that was normal. It was the system defending itself against a threat. And now, as that system turns its attention to figures like Comey who are part of that defense, you see the difference in treatment. You see the gentle handling, the procedural concerns, the willingness to entertain technical challenges that would never fly in cases against political outsiders. It's not that Comey is definitely innocent or definitely guilty, that's for courts to decide. It's that the process itself reveals whose side the system is on. The same pattern shows up in California. When federal investigators started looking into Williamson's conduct, the response from Newsom's administration wasn't outrage or demands for transparency. It was carefully managed PR. Statements about ongoing investigations, reminders that everyone deserves due process. All technically true, all perfectly reasonable, but noticeably different from how these same political figures respond when their opponents face similar situations. Now, you might be thinking, but wait, if the system is so protective of its own, how did these arrests happen at all? How did California officials end up in handcuffs if the establishment always shields itself? That's a fair question, and the answer tells us something important about where we are as a country right now. The arrests happened because the investigation started years ago, before the current political landscape fully formed, and because some prosecutors and investigators still take their oaths seriously regardless of political implications. They saw evidence of wrongdoing and they pursued it. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how the system is designed to work. But the fact that it feels remarkable, the fact that we're almost surprised when powerful people face real consequences, tells you how far things have drifted from that ideal. There are still people inside the Department of Justice, inside federal law enforcement, who believe in doing their jobs without calculating political fallout. But those people are increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly outnumbered by others who see every decision through a political lens. Reports have been surfacing for months now about career prosecutors resigning rather than participate in what they consider politicized investigations, not just in one office, but across multiple districts. Some of these resignations happened in Florida, where prosecutors were reportedly asked to help build a sprawling conspiracy case connecting the Russia investigation through the Jack Smith prosecutions into one massive alleged plot against Trump. According to people familiar with the situation, 2 junior prosecutors resigned because they believed what they were being asked to do crossed ethical lines. The U.S. attorney there felt compelled to call a meeting of several dozen lawyers to address growing unease about the direction of the office. This is what instability inside the justice system looks like. When career professionals start quitting rather than compromise their ethics, when meetings have to be held to reassure staff about controversial investigations, when leadership has to sign off on subpoenas personally instead of letting line prosecutors handle them, those are all signs that something has gone wrong. The system is bending under political pressure, and the people inside it know it. And it's not limited to federal prosecutors. Even some judges, people appointed to lifetime positions specifically to insulate them from political pressure, are stepping down rather than participate in what they see as the corruption of their institutions. There are reports of Reagan-appointed judges, people who served under one of the most conservative presidents in modern history, choosing to leave the bench rather than be complicit in what they view as the politicization of justice. Think about what that means. These aren't young idealists disappointed that the world doesn't match their expectations. These are experienced legal professionals, people who've spent decades navigating the complexities of law and politics, who've seen difficult cases and controversial rulings, who understand that justice is rarely simple, and they're walking away because something about the current moment feels different, feels worse, feels like a line being crossed that can't be uncrossed. This kind of institutional crisis doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the cumulative effect of years of erosion, norms being violated, precedents being ignored, political considerations overwhelming legal ones. And it feeds on itself. When good people leave, the institutions become more vulnerable to those willing to bend them toward political ends. which causes more good people to leave, which makes the problem worse. It's a cycle that's very hard to reverse once it gets started. Meanwhile, back in California, the fallout from the Newsom-connected arrests is spreading beyond just the 5 people indicted. The scandal has triggered a broader conversation about how California's government has been operating, about what other corruption might be hiding just beneath the surface. And it's intersecting with other controversies that were already brewing. Just yesterday, California's Department of Motor Vehicles announced it was canceling more than 15,000 commercial driver's licenses that had been issued improperly. These weren't regular licenses, these were CDLs, the kind you need to operate big rigs, semi-trucks, school buses. And according to the Federal Department of Transportation, California officials admitted these licenses had been issued illegally to people who shouldn't have had them, many of whom weren't even in the country legally. The Transportation Secretary put out a statement saying California had been caught red-handed after weeks of denying any wrongdoing. He said the 15,000 cancelled licenses were just the tip of the iceberg and that his team would continue forcing California to prove they'd removed every unauthorized driver from behind the wheel of commercial vehicles. Now, why does this matter in the context of corruption and justice? Because it's another example of the same pattern. Rules being bent or ignored by officials who think they know better, who think their political objectives justify cutting corners, who assume they won't face real accountability because they're part of the protected class, and the consequences aren't abstract. They're measured in lives. There have been multiple fatal accidents in recent months involving commercial vehicles driven by people who had no business operating those trucks. One case that got significant attention involved a driver whose license listed his first name as "no name given." Literally, that's what it said on an official state-issued document that was also marked as a real ID, the kind of identification that's supposed to meet strict federal security standards. How does something like that happen? How does a state agency issue a commercial driver's license to someone whose name they don't even have? The only answer is systemic dysfunction, either through incompetence or through deliberate disregard for rules that were seen as inconvenient to other policy goals. And either way, regular people pay the price when those trucks crash, when those untrained drivers lose control of 80,000-pound vehicles on highways where your family might be traveling. This is what institutional corruption looks like in practice. It's not always briefcases full of cash or dramatic arrests. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to ignore rules, to process paperwork without proper verification, to prioritize political objectives over public safety, and it accumulates over time until you have a system where nobody quite knows who's actually qualified to do what, who's really supposed to be here, who's been properly vetted and who slipped through because asking too many questions became politically incorrect. For many of you watching this, especially those who've lived through enough decades to remember when government institutions functioned more reliably, this erosion feels deeply personal. You remember when a driver's license meant something, when you had to actually prove who you were and demonstrate competence before the state trusted you with that responsibility. You remember when political corruption was met with resignations and apologies, not PR strategies and legal maneuvering. The disconnect between that remembered reality and the present situation creates a profound sense of loss. Not just loss of efficiency or competence, but loss of the shared standards that made society function. When everyone understood that certain rules applied to everyone, there was at least the possibility of fairness. But when those rules become optional for some and strictly enforced for others, the entire foundation starts to crack. And this is exactly where Trump's message gains momentum. His core argument about a rigged system playing favorites resonates because people can see the evidence with their own eyes. They see the dual justice system. They see the corruption. They see the double standards. And they're angry about it. Trump uses both of these scandals, the Comey case and the Newsom arrests, to reinforce that narrative. He points to the gentle handling Comey receives despite serious allegations and contrasts it with the aggressive prosecution his own associates faced. He points to Newsom calling his administration corrupt while Newsom's own chief of staff stands accused of actual old-fashioned graft. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. And here's the thing. The message is landing, not just with Trump's base, but with people who never particularly liked him, who might have voted against him, but who are so exhausted by the hypocrisy and dishonesty of the establishment that they're willing to overlook his flaws, because at least he's fighting against the right targets. At least he's naming the problem, even if his solutions aren't always perfect. This is how trust collapses. This is how societies fracture. When people lose faith that institutions will treat them fairly, when they believe justice depends on your political connections rather than the facts of your case, when they see their own struggles ignored while elites live lavishly on funds meant for public purposes, that's when social contracts start to break down. But there's something even more insidious happening beneath these specific scandals, something about how we consume and understand justice itself in the modern age. Justice has become a brand, a media product, something shaped more by headlines and cable news narratives than by actual verdicts and evidence. The word corruption means one thing when applied to Trump, another thing entirely when applied to Democratic officials. The standards of proof shift. The presumption of innocence applies selectively. The intensity of coverage varies wildly depending on whose scandal we're talking about. You can see this in how the media has covered these two stories. The Comey case gets framed as a concerning example of potential government overreach, with careful language about allegations and due process. The Newsom-connected arrests get brief mentions, often buried, with heavy emphasis on the fact that Newsom himself hasn't been charged. Meanwhile, any Trump-adjacent scandal, no matter how thin the evidence, gets treated as definitive proof of systemic wrongdoing, with breathless coverage and endless speculation. This isn't journalism. It's advocacy dressed up as reporting, and it means that